Let me share the screen. So last week we were learning about the principle of under what circumstances can you compel a member of your community to participate in the mitzvah of tzedakah. And it seems like there are certain conditions where you can compel someone to give tzedakah. And the discussion was surrounding, like, what is the basis for being able to compel someone to give tzedakah? Normally, we don't compel people to do a mitzvah aseh. So it seemed like that there are a number of poskim who say that because there's a mitzvah lo aseh of lo sikpotz es yadecha, that you cannot withhold your hand or close your hand for the poor. So therefore, that was the basis of being able to coerce a member of your community to give. But he says, "Ulam shekeshaboim." This is what we were up to. He says, "Ulam shekeshabaim lachuf b'derech klal omed lefanenu safek kama oto ashir ra'ui lo latet." Then we're faced with the following doubt: how much can we compel someone to give? So the Meiri, in commenting, there's the kupa and then there's the tamchoy. Kupa is the daily tzedakah pushka, and the tamchoy is the weekly food bank, right? And so referring to the food bank, the Meiri writes, "V'chol shehu tzarech umdana b'shikol hadas, u'kedinei mamanis, shetzrichen ba lebeistin nota lelech bo achar harov." He says you need a beis din, number one, to make an evaluation, and you follow the majority ruling of that beis din. So as long as two dayanim rule that the person should give X, that's what you compel him to give. So he says you need to have some kind of evaluation made. So that's the quote from the Meiri. He says, and therefore you see that you need to have a beis din for each individual to be able to assess how much that person is capable of giving. The imkain tzarech loymar kimashe kasavnu shadai biyachid lachuf al tzedakah zedavka biyachid sheyachol ladun yechidi. He says, therefore, according to those opinions that even one person can compel another person to give tzedakah, because after all, our original question was, can a wife take her husband's money without his knowledge under the rubric of coercing someone to give tzedakah? And the answer is that that's only true if she knows for a fact that she's not overspending on that mitzvah of tzedakah. And that's not an easy thing to be able to verify, especially if she's not aware of certain financial aspects of the husband's work, of the husband's business. He says, "V'hinei b'tzedakah kofen al yidei shiyordim l'nechasav bal karcho, hainu delo kofen ad sheyitein me'atzmo." He says, when we say that, with the law of tzedakah, the Shulchan Aruch's language is, we enter into his assets against his will, which means that we don't physically coerce him to give, but we actually just go straight to where his money is kept and we confiscate his assets. V'hamakar hu me'hagemara b'bava basra shememashchen in al tzedakah v'chein pasak b'Shulchan Aruch zal. That's the language of the Gemara, and that's the language of the Shulchan Aruch. Not that you can physically coerce a person to give tzedakah, right? But it's like you don't take him to beis din and flog him until he gives. That we don't permit. But rather, what we do allow is, let's say, the repo man to come into a guy's house, the marshal to come into a person's house, what do they call it here in Ontario? The sheriff, to come into a fellow's house. Sheriff comes in and he says, we hear that you haven't been giving your share of tzedakah, so we're confiscating your painting off your wall, and we're going to sell it, and we're going to use that for tzedakah. That was what they did in the good old days. Umashma d'mimashchenin ba'al korcho, and it sounds like that this can be done even against his will. V'chein nira l'dayik mimasha kosav b'shut noda b'Yehuda, and he quotes from the Noda b'Yehuda to indicate that that's the language as well. I'm going to skip that. He says, "V'hatam shebitzdaka yordam l'nechasaf bal korcho b'vor b'ktzos hachoshen." So he says, now what's the reason that you can invade a person's assets against his will? Shehu mitnei shezeh chelek mikfi ala mitzvah sha'ad sha'at tekofeu begufo techafeu b'mamono. So he says the Ktzos says this is the preferred method of coercion. Better to just confiscate a person's assets without affecting his physical person. In other words, we're not going to allow you to beat him up in order to get him to give, but we do allow you just to take his money. According to a previous opinion, it's to prevent a person from doing an aveira. Okay, let me just that's right. In other words, according to this idea, look, we have this. First of all, obviously, there are limitations when you live under a government that's not a Jewish authority, right? So we say Dina de Malchus Dina. None of this is applicable today, but it's relevant to our discussion of whether a woman can take against his will or against his knowledge a husband's assets. So we're going to skip the rest of this and go into our next siman. And he says, Od be'inyan hanal. He says, to continue our previous responsum, ulam hadinhu she'ein lechafot al tzedakah lelo yedias ha'ba'olam. He says, however, in the final analysis, you cannot coerce someone to give tzedakah without their knowledge. In other words, it's one thing to say, Reb Yankel, you're obligated to give tzedakah. He says, I don't want to. He says, we know you don't want to. We're coming into your house now and we're taking your painting so we can sell it for tzedakah. Okay, that's the first thing that we've established. But what if you take it without his knowledge? Is that permitted? So in this point, he says, no, it's not. And this is according to even the opinion who says that even an individual can coerce another person to give tzedakah. Lefize benidon dinan asur liisha laseis litzedakah mimamon baila lelo yediaso. According to this opinion, it would be forbidden for a woman to take her husband's tzedakah money and give it without his knowledge, because it's one thing to confront a person face to face and say, we're taking your money. It's another thing to take it without them even knowing about it. So he says like this. So in the footnote, he says, Hine, take care, see you. Hine kasher isha notenet litzdaka lelo reshut lelo yediya shel baila omedes lefanenu hashe'ela ha'im niten lechafod legabot tzedaka lelo yediyat ha'be'alim. So he says, getting back to our original question, it's worse because she wants to take the money without even telling her husband. Because the commentaries say that the only time that the Shulchan Aruch permits you to take tzedakah against a person's will is only if it's in front of him, and it's only if after he's been confronted with it. Umishanosein pachos mimasharoi litain, Bastin hayukofen oso umaken oso makas mardus achiyitain masham du litain. He says if a person gives less than what he's been assessed by the Bastin had a right to flog him and give him wax, give him rabbinic lashes until he gives what he's supposed to. V'yordim l'nechasav b'fanav v'lochin mimenu masharoi lo litain. And so the language of the Shulchan Aruch is you have to do it in his presence, take his stuff. Why does it have to be with his knowledge? If he's refusing to give, why do I have to notify him that I'm taking his stuff? If he's not doing the mitzvah, why can't I coerce the mitzvah even without his knowledge? So the answer that the Beis Meir gives, who's one of the commentaries, he says, "Mavur sheposkim lahalacha ka'arambam, shemi shahalach lemedina sayam, ein yordim l'nechasav shelo b'fanav legabos tzedakah, shema nasan sham tzedakah ve'enu chayiv od." So one reason he says is because you don't know. Maybe the guy left town, and when he was out of town, he gave tzedakah there, and maybe he already fulfilled his mitzvah. So how can you possibly know without consulting with him? V'chein kasvu b'kesef mishnah b'beis Yaakov. L'fi zeh ma de'ein yordam l'nechasav shelo b'fanav afilu kishelo halach l'medina sayam u'mishum dechosheshim shenasan staka b'seiser ve'eno megaleh. So maybe the same thing would be true in our situation. Maybe the husband can claim that he gave tzedakah already without informing his wife and without telling anyone else in the community. He wanted to do it secretly. Ve'eno chayv l'tzedakah klal. But by confronting him, he would notify us. I have not found any other reason for this distinction to be made in the poskim as to why you dafka have to confront him before you forcefully take his money. The gam lebeistin ein mershus likach mimenu b'li yediaso rak modin u'memashchinin belochen b'fanav balkarcho aval b'li yediaso ginevahi ad kan l'shana. So the Noda B'Yehuda says explicitly that to take the money without his knowledge, just to go into his house without notifying him, and to take his assets, that is geneva, even if the Beistin, even if the community does it. So there's no justification for it whatsoever. Lefize, ba'adam ashir she'en rosa laseis litzdaka, efshar lachufa so shelo b'fanav mikiven shelefia beis Meir habeis Yaakov and Yehuda yesh bazeh safek gezel ki yacholio shim hayinu kofim oso b'fanav hayim agalolon shevetzim karnas and mashu chayv. He's just reviewing. There's absolutely no heter to take someone's money without their knowledge. So he says, "Ulam yesh lechalek shahaposkim hanal dibru legabe asher shlanimtza lefanenu velo sirev afpam lebeistin lases. Ulam benidon dinan imedurma legabe asher shekulam yadu bo sheina rotza lases klal yesh lomer shein chashash shemanasim b'seis b'makom acher." But what if you know for a fact he didn't give? What if you can verify that he didn't give to any other place? So that's what he wants to argue, is that maybe there's still wiggle room. So let's finish up on top. He says, "V'yesh misha omer shalamrot sharak beistin shel gimel yacholachu palatztaka v'gam beistin sarchi dias ha'ba'olim." He says there is an opinion that would argue that even though you need a beistin of 3 people to make an assessment, and you need the person's knowledge before you forcefully take his assets, mikol makom, Kaven she'en lanu beistin lazeh, memela yesh heter l'chol echad lachuf al zeh, ulam tzarech iyanim efshar lismoch alav lahakel. He says this is just going back to the original discussion as far as can you be lenient to rely on just one individual making that assessment. And that's really not germane to our discussion now about taking something without his knowledge. So he says, V'nei b'shut Noda B'Yehuda, we'll just continue down below. He says, the note of Behuda does say in another tshuva, he says, Dan lagabi isha shabala kamsan, behi mechaleket staka lefi oshul lo yidiyasa v'zelashana. The note of Behuda actually addresses the following circumstance, where a woman is taking her husband's money, who is a known miser, and she's using that money to give to tzedakah without his knowledge. And he writes, Chas v'shalom lekabel mimena v'hu gezel gamor. It is absolutely forbidden to accept any money from her. It is considered to be completely thievery. Ve'av shebeis kofen al tzedakah mikol makom misamis ha'isha l'shofetes. He says, but who made her the judge? In other words, yes, does a Beis Din have a right to collect tzedakah forcefully? Of course, but who made her the dayan? The isha psula ladon, v'gam lebeis din mishus likach mimenu b'li yediyaso akam l'shana. She's not fit to be a dayan, and furthermore, even if she was fit to be a dayan, you can't take a person's tzedakah without their knowledge. Umashma she'ena isha yechol lachuf ala tzedakah. And therefore, it seems from the Noda Behuda quite clear that a woman cannot take her husband's money. Ulam ba'arach hashulchan, maybe shitas Noda Behuda v'cholek alav v'zelashona. The Aruch HaShulchan actually cites the Noda Behuda, but then ends up disagreeing with him, and he says, "Afal gav de kefia hu midas haba'olam v'kan hu shalom midaito mikol makom achiyuv mutal alav anachnu danin bazeh kefi chiyuvo ad kan l'shona." The Aruch HaShulchan is prepared to say that even though it's against the husband's knowledge, but since we know that he's obligated to give a certain amount, in other words, let's say in a situation where we know that the husband, let's say, has a communal obligation, the community has assessed a certain amount on every family, or based on just a head tax, or based on a person's income, and the man has refused to give, we are allowed to accept it from the woman, according to the Aruch HaShulchan, because it's his obligation, and she's just helping him fulfill his obligation. So you see that according at least to the Aruch HaShulchan, it is permissible for a woman to forcefully take the money from her husband, even without his knowledge. So v'nira ha'aruch hashulchan nakot shemi ikar hadin ba'inan based in lachuf al mitzvahs aseh ve'al tzedakah rak mishum she'en lanu hayom based in lazeh iter lecholecha lachuf al tzedakah. It sounds like what the Aruch HaShulchan is saying is that even though lechatchila you really do need a based in, but since no Beis Din is going to convene for this purpose, nowadays we don't have such Batei Din who sit down and do an evaluation of a person's assets. Therefore, we allow individuals to collect instead. Even without the knowledge of the person, and that seems bizarre, just as it seems very bizarre, especially in light of the fact that you have this concern that you don't know for a fact that he didn't fulfill his obligation. Ulam yesh lahadgish she'aruch hashulchan lo hiter ela la'acher sherav ha'ir nasan heter v'kava kama bala ro'i laseis v'zelashana. But the Aruch HaShulchan does underscore that this can only be done after the Rav of the city has paskined that the wife is allowed to give. In other words, it's not that a woman can independently make this decision on her own. My husband is not giving enough. She's got to go to the Rav. The Rav has to investigate. And after he's deemed the husband to be recalcitrant in his payment to the community of what he owes, he paskins that it's okay for her to take money secretly from him. Amnam im harab shebeir omer lala shelafi ercho im haisa yadenu takifa hayinu kofen osa liten kach v'kach yechola liten kashir hazeh ad kam l'shana. As he says, it's only if the Rav of the city tells her that this is what we expect from your husband that she's allowed to do it. And therefore, we have to conclude that it's only in a scenario where we don't have this possibility that the husband gave independently in secrecy. ולכן חיובו של בעלה היה ברור ולא היה צורך לידיעתו כדי לחופה. And then and only then would a woman be allowed to take the money from her husband in secrecy. And remember, again, it's where there's, let's say, a communal responsibility on each family. So the husband can't say, well, I gave tzedakah somewhere else. That's fine that you gave tzedakah somewhere else, but you have an obligation to be part of the communal donation. And that's also in the Shulchan Aruch, that any community has a right to assess the members of the community who wish to use its resources, such as the mikvah, the Beis HaKnesses, and any other communal, let's say, resources. A community can say that what we call the Tovei Ha'ir, the community council, they can say, this is what we're assessing each family. And a guy says, no, I don't want to pay that. It's like, it's almost, it's gepaskind in Shulchan Aruch, that if a community says, listen, this is our shul, this is what it costs for you to become a member, and you have to pay that amount in order to be able to use our resources. If a person says, I don't want to pay that, and then we say, well, we have an obligations committee. In other words, we have this committee that will lower your amount if you say that you have a financial hardship. But if the guy says, no, I'm not willing to go through that process, it's not that I can't afford it, I just don't want to pay. I don't feel that I want to support this shul, but he comes to shul every day, right? I have other priorities in my life right now. I've given enough, right, in the past, right? So that's not acceptable according to the Shulchan Aruch. Person cannot utilize community resources without paying what the community assesses him for those resources. Yes, we are making that assumption. We are making that assumption because, and here's where, based on what we've learned before, but he hasn't even mentioned community resources. He's just said, let's say there is a community that assesses each family for a certain amount of tzedakah every year. Let's say we're not talking about community resources. Let's say we live in a community where we have aniyim, and each family is assessed. We expect every family to give $1,000 a year towards supporting the poor, towards feeding the homeless. Right. You're right. That's not even towards a community resource. So you're right. As Lloyd wants to argue, maybe that's not even under the rubric of tzedakah anymore. It's really a consumable resource, right? That the person's benefiting from a resource and he should pay for it. Okay, that's also possible. Okay. But based on what we've learned before, supporting a Beis HaKnesses does fall under the rubric of tzedakah. Okay. And then he says, what about the Noda B'Yehuda's objection that who made this woman into a judge, and a woman is not fit to be a judge? So what gives her the right to take the husband's money? He says, Nira shelo hiter elo lemisha roi lios dayan v'gam nismano l'zal yedei hatzibur. So he says, you see from that language, and the Aruch HaShulchan seems to circumvent that by placing the rabbi as the arbiter, right? She has to first go to the rabbi. So he says, so it turns out that anytime you're going to take a husband's money without his knowledge, it has to be someone who's fit to be a dayan. Okay, I'm skipping that rest of that paragraph. Ula mashmos hashulchan aruchi she'en legaba tzedakah l'yidis habaylim below muva bepoiskim mishi yisbar shelo tzarich yidiyas habalim. He says, but even with all of that said, it sounds like that the Shulchan Aruch is more machmir. Despite the ruling of the Aruch HaShulchan, the Shulchan Aruch itself does not seem to permit confiscating someone's assets without their knowledge. He says there's no opinion that says that even if you're 100% sure that the husband has not given money, you can just take his money. And therefore, And therefore, we are left sort of with scratching our heads in on the opinion of the Aruch HaShulchan. How could he allow a woman to take her husband's assets without his permission? Because it seems that there's a preponderance of text in the Shulchan Aruch and the other poskim that would not allow such a thing. So it could be, that maybe the Aruch HaShulchan, knowing in his community how people behave, maybe he made a special exception. But it seems like from the other poskim that this is not something that you can really rely on. So even though the Aruch HaShulchan says it, and normally we do side with the Aruch HaShulchan in many instances, the author here is arguing against the Aruch HaShulchan that using a man's tzedakah funds when he doesn't even know that it was taken out of his bank account or out of his house is not going to be permitted. Then we go to Od Be'inyan Hanal. Let's continue this discussion. He says, Yesh lahoyer shebegemara bava basra isa shekedei lechapot al hatzdaka tzarech lahagia ledin shel srara ve'ein srara pachos mishnayim. He says the language of the Gemara in Bava Basra implies that the only way that you can coerce someone to give tzedakah, even with their knowledge, is only when you have a din of surara, of legal authority to do so. A person cannot gain that legal authority as a single individual. The kan yisporish is a dafka begabai or bebeistin sheismanal deyatzibra lachuf al tzedakah. And it seems, therefore, that only when a person is officially and formally appointed as a tzedakah collector or as a beis-din, can a person be coerced by that individual who has been appointed by the community to confiscate against their will their assets. Amnam yachid sheba biyuzmato lachuf al tzedakah lo tzarech lahagia lisrara. He says, however, what we will explain is, he says, "B'meila b'nidon didan b'isha shabala ina rotzalas es klal lo tzarech lahagia ledin shel sarara." He wants to make the argument that it's only when you're an independent body that you have to be authorized by the beis-din in order to collect. But what if you're coming as an individual who wishes to coerce a person to do a mitzvah because he's otherwise committing a mitzvah lo sasya? In that circumstance, there's an argument to be made that you don't need to reach the level of official authority. Sometimes an individual would have the right to confiscate a person's assets, even if they haven't been appointed. And using that argument, maybe you could say that a woman is allowed to take her husband's assets, but we still paskin not that way. We still paskin. And so what we're going to do is we're going to skip over all of this discussion because it's not halacha l'maisa. And the final, I guess there's one more skip over all of this. And the last thing to discuss is be'inyan kfiya ba'arama al tzedakah, is to discuss using deceitful practices to get someone to donate. That'll be our next shaila, and it's certainly related to this whole discussion. We'll hold it here for today. We're on break until through next week. I'm going to take a few extra days off, and we'll see you, Mirza Hashem. I'll let you know by the WhatsApp when we're reconvening. Okay, everybody.
Have a nice break.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.